So while Web3 is a relatively new concept for consumers, policymakers, and even some established industries, our members have been thinking about Web3 for years. As developers learn more about Web3 and its innovation potential, we're here to help policymakers get ahead of the curve in understanding how innovators are leveraging Web3 and also preview the kinds of issues that might invite debate in the future in the Web3 space. So during today's briefing, we're going to hear from small businesses across the app economy on different aspects of Web3, how they're using it currently, and where it could go in the future. We're also going to be talking about what policymakers and regulators can do to support and advance innovation when it comes to Web3. So like I said, we're here to talk through a bunch of different use cases for Web3. This includes digital assets like cryptocurrency, NFTs, blockchain, DAO, virtual and augmented reality environments like the metaverse, and so much more. So with that, I'm going to throw it to our esteemed panelists to take it from here, introduce themselves, and kind of give a little overview of who you are and what you do in the Web3 space. Dele, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dele Atanda. I run a company called Metame, which is really focused on data sovereignty and data ownership, and really sort of empowering people to take control and ownership of their data. Sort of runs in parallel with an NGO that we created called the Internet Foundation, which basically works on policy around that sort of thing and recommendation and advocacy work around that, looking at it primarily from the vantage point of human rights.
Steve.
Happy to go next. Hi, my name is Stephen Forte, and I'm an entrepreneur who has turned into a venture capitalist. And my firm is called Fresno Capital. We invest in early stage companies, including companies that are in the Web3 space, which you'll hear about today.
And Thomas.
I'm Thomas Korchinski, co-founder of DevScale. We primarily focus on two kind of types of clients where we work with early stage businesses and come in as advisors when they're building software, and then also larger stage businesses to build full-fledged mobile web apps. And then my business partner, Sean, and I also co-host a podcast and YouTube channel called Built on Web3. As we see the whole Web2 world kind of turning and morphing into Web3 with different development opportunities, and one of the things we focus on is trying to talk about the practical applications of Web3 versus all the theoretical and fancy things, because Web3 is so much more than really expensive JPEGs.
Really?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you to our panelists for lending your time and expertise to this panel. I'm very excited to kick this off with answering the question, what is Web3? Not to make this about myself or sound ridiculous, but before I had the understanding of Web3 that I do now, and shout out to New Orleans Entrepreneur Week for evangelizing me to the world of Web3 earlier this year. But before I was comfortable with the world of Web3, I would hear terms like metaverse, cryptocurrency, and two things happened. One, I would roll my eyes. And two, depending on how much sleep I did or did not have, my brain would either go crazy and think about all the opportunities and what the metaverse looked like, or it would go completely blank, no thoughts, just vibes, because I had no idea of what to even conceptualize. So not trying to project here, but maybe there are some folks who feel a little bit overwhelmed by the world of Web3. So can you just level with us and kind of help break it down? What is Web3? Maybe kind of take it back to the first iteration of the web and walk us through how we got here. Would love to start with like Steve or Thomas.
Sure thing. I could give a brief overview, but Thomas has a good overview as well. So I'll be brief. I'll actually talk in broad strokes and let Thomas kind of do the walk down memory lane. Is Web3 in its basic core is the attempt to bring a level of decentralization to the centralized web that we have today. The original web, and Thomas will talk a little bit about this, like Web 1 was actually highly decentralized. And then we moved into like Facebook owning all your data and photos and YouTube owning all your videos and very centralized. So Web 3 when we eventually look back at Web3, whenever we have the webinar, what is Web4, and we start talking about Web3, we will cast success or failure on Web3 of how less centralized Web3 made Web2. Right. So that at the core, it's just a way to take a little bit of power away from like those centralization, companies and authorities, and bring a little bit more power to the users. I'll sit back and let Thomas add to that, because he's got a very eloquent explanation.
Well, yeah. So, Steve, no, you said it really well. I'd say Web 1 is at the early stages. And if we want to assign a time range, this has probably started in the early 90s, maybe like late 80s, but from the 90s to early kind of mid 2000s, like 2004 or 5. And that was usually classified as read. So Web 1 is read, Web 2 is read, write, and Web 3 is read, write, and own. But so going back to Web 1, that means basically that we have a message board. We have things like FTP where we can download information, but we're not interacting with anything. And that's when Web 2 came around. When we started interacting, we started having social media, MySpace, all that good stuff. And we started tagging, we started uploading, and we started interacting. And so that's the difference between Web 1 and Web 2, is that interactivity piece. But with that came that centralization as well. If we see today in the current kind of interwebs of things, the internets of things, right? We have all these major companies controlling so much of the internet. And a lot of our data is owned by them too. When you interact with someone on Facebook, Facebook owns that. When you interact with someone on Twitter, Twitter owns that. If you post something on Craigslist, Craigslist has that. And so Web3 is this, there's a lot of things that happen. And what Steve said with decentralization is probably a core tenet of it, where all of a sudden it's like giving people back their power and their ownership. And so that's that third term, how we like Web3 is read, write, and own. Web3 is all about ownership, so that you have control over your data, so that you're not being monetized like you are in the Web 2 space. Everybody knows that Facebook, for example, uses your data to sell to you. That's not really the case in the Web 3 world. The other thing is that there's a lot of transparency within Web3, because everything's public. If you hear about that, like on the blockchain, and we'll probably talk about that in a little bit too. And then there's other kind of really fun terms like trustless. And that's not to mean that, hey, like there's no trust. It's just that there's an absence of needing for you to actually trust in a third party to verify things, because everything is run algorithmically, so that it just is what it is, and it's just kind of trusted by default. So I don't know if Steve and Deli, if you'd add anything else to that.
No, I think it's very well put. I mean, I would agree. I think the primary premise of Web3 is ownership, and the mechanic through which that's delivered is decentralization. And I think that's the important aspect of it. And I think the issue of about trustlessness is central to that, because through decentralization, effectively, it removes the need to trust third parties. We can trust in the network. We can trust in the resilience of the network to deliver against the tasks that we give applications to do. And that's the real power of it.
Absolutely. I remember in our panel prep call, we were talking about what does Web3 mean to you? And you said it's data ownership. That's everything. That's what this is all about. So I think that, when I was learning about, Web3 and going through the iterations of the web is what really helped me kind of conceptualize and understand what it means. And that data ownership component is probably what excited me the most. Of course, it's fun to look metaverse, this and that, but the way that it can really revolutionize the way that consumers deal with their own data is exceptional. So kind of piggybacking off that, we're lucky enough to have three unique perspectives here on this panel, a developer, an investor, and then a metaverse expert. So what I want to talk about is kind of those particular verticals and how Web3 is working within revolutionizing and creating these verticals. How is Web3 transforming this for you? What does your day-to-day look like? Just would love to hear different perspectives from three different folks in this industry?
So from the development space, Web3 is absolutely fascinating, and it's a new digital frontier. And what I mean by that is all of a sudden we have so many new possibilities that previously weren't there, both from an interactivity to a distribution and kind of so forth. There's just like endless possibilities, and we'll talk about like the metaverse too. But one of the cool things is this idea that because you own your own data, all of a sudden applications have a totally different meaning. So there's this thing called cold starts and hot starts. In today's world, when you want to build a new software business, if you want to build a competitor to Facebook, you have to get your own users. You have to encourage people to come on board. You have to build all of this versus in the Web3 ecosystem. And so that's called a cold start. In the Web3 ecosystem, we have hot starts, which basically means that you just need to build on top of a protocol that isn't governed by any central body. It's a group, it's open source, and you can create your own app. It could be super simple, but all of a sudden, if there's another app, and let's say it's like Facebook, we're on this protocol as well, everybody and every single user can actually immediately start using your own application from the get-go. And so what we're going to be seeing is like an explosion of new types of businesses and new types of applications that are actually going to happen because of the Web3 space. And then there's also going to be so many different types of microeconomies and different types of businesses that sprout about it, such as, and you see organizations already doing this like Royal.io, where artists can come, both physical, digital art or music creators and so forth. They can give you a small percentage of their royalties that they actually generate, probably why they call it Royal.io. There's different ways that you can actually monetize your data through protocols like Ocean, where you can obfuscate the actual core data and keep that secure, but you can run algorithms on top of that so that we can solve bigger problems faster, as opposed to having this siloed behind different agencies. And then we can also give different credentials and kind of bring more of a community and so forth, like ecosystem to it. So yeah, that's kind of like my first take at it. But Steve, Deli, do you guys have anything else to add to that?
Go ahead, Steve, please.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add. I mean, besides saying all of the above, from the investment side of things, there's two things that have happened. First is the structures for investing have been new and challenging. Meaning is because these tokens are liquid. Venture capital usually invests it for 10 years and then waits for these companies to go IPO. When you're dealing with some of these Web3 projects, you're dealing with the more liquid assets, which means we have to get different licenses. So like there's that aspect of it, but that's just mechanics. But the exciting part of this is that in the past, a venture capitalist will have to go out and then hope that a good, solid entrepreneur can pitch them a cool project. So if you want to find the next big, Microsoft or Apple to put your money into as a venture capitalist, you have to go out and like really search for these entrepreneurs. With Web3, with most of these things being on the blockchain, you can participate in the ecosystem and be part of these projects, be part of these ecosystems as a user, and then be invited in to invest either personally or as part of your fund. So you really get to participate in much, much more than you did in what we would say would be Web 2, right? Because by the time you found, let's say, a Facebook or a Twitter or Instagram, it already was relatively big and you're kind of getting drowned out in the noise. But in these Web3 ecosystems, it's still so new, we have the opportunity to participate in them, test them out, do the due diligence that way, see what these protocols are doing, see what these projects are doing. So that's the difference in the in the day-to-day, so to speak, of what it means. And it's more global. That's the other thing too, right? There's people participating more and more, even more than Web 2 was.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think as Caitlin said at the beginning, my focus has always really been around data, and that really ends up being pretty central to everything that we're talking about. And on one hand, we as an organization have focused on thinking about data from first principles. And I think when you start to look at it from that basis, everything changes. I think Thomas was really sort of painting a picture about this new sort of canvas of possibilities that emerges from this. And that is phenomenal on an economic front. And, as Thomas said, there are very different mechanics for participation, for investment, for value realization. But I think the thing that is, particularly looking at this from a policy perspective, is at the heart of what we're talking about here when we talk about decentralization and ownership and property rights is a very tangible form of democratization. And you'll hear that term a lot in the Web3 space. People talk about democratizing the web and whatnot. But that really comes back to this citizen power in effect. This idea that people, another term that is used a lot is self-sovereign. And that essentially is that as an individual, as a person, you have ownership and control of your assets, of your estate, which essentially is your digital footprint, your data and everything. And I think that has such fundamental implications when you look at the way societies are structured in that regards. And I think there's a balancing of power. There's a balancing, as again, Thomas referenced the hot, cold starts. It changes the paradigm at a very fundamental level. And in that sense, countries like America that are at the forefront of democracy and maintaining democracy really need to kind of look at it from this perspective and look at this as a fundamental democracy enabler. If you look at antitrust and all of this anti-monopoly sort of issues that we're dealing with around tech, Web3 particularly is designed to, at a fundamental infrastructural level, redress that.
Absolutely. And I took some notes earlier when we were chatting. You said that this is bigger than the Industrial Revolution, you believe. I think that is true, A, and B, would love to hear you just kind of give a quick run through in your mind what that looks like. Can you make a comparison? Can you say like what makes you believe that? I would love for folks to hear and understand where you're coming from when you say that.
Sure. And it's you start to get into very philosophical territory very quickly in this space from this, right? But I actually think that it's as significant as the cognitive revolution in the sense where we became human, in that sense, where we became conscious. And, in industrialization changed the paradigm it changed the world order. That's clear to say in terms of how that happened. I mean, agricultural revolution, those are the sort of big epochs, right? Cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, the framework for modern societies was essentially established. Now, I think the digital revolution, essentially, which is what Web3 is really at the cusp of, and I think it's important to look at it in that context. It's a continuation of the digital revolution, which in itself is closely aligned with the information revolution. So if you look at the information revolution from the printing press, look how that changed the world, and the implications in terms of the ability to proliferate innovation and knowledge and science and development and all of these sort of values from the information revolution was dramatic. And then the digital revolution has acutely amplified that. And I think that the technologies of the 21st century, the engine of the 21st century is fundamentally going to be AI. And I think that we're already in that era. The data economy is already established. McKinsey did a report, I often say, back in 2016, where it showed that more GDP is generated around the world from the movement of data than from the movement of physical goods. So we are clearly in a data economy currently. And again, the internet as a phenomenon has been the greatest driver of wealth and prosperity known to man, and one of the most successful machines known to man in that regards as well. So I think when you put it in all of that context, and even if you look at the Industrial Revolution 4.0, which has been a bit of a popular theme over the last 5 years or so, it's all based on robotics and automation. It all comes, again, back to data and AI in that sense. So that's really, I think, what this technology, blockchain, crypto, and crypto in that sense. And I think you have to look at it in that context. The ability to combine money with code, with automation into a single unit is unprecedented. And what that means from an innovation perspective is we're just starting to get glimpses of the kind of possibilities that are before us there. So hopefully that gives a bit of clarity.
Deli, with what you were saying, kind of with this idea of combining money and code and people and, you know, communities, is basically what a DAO is. And if anybody's heard of decentralized autonomous organizations, that's basically the essence of a DAO. In super simplified terms, think of it's a group chat with a bank account, almost. And you get to do things and decide. And like the cool thing is that because we are marrying this like virtual world, and the metaverse is going to be a huge part of this, and this anonymity, people being anonymous or choosing to be, people being distributed, things being decentralized, no one having a central authority. We can have these groups of people do really cool things because they are self-governed and self-controlled, and they can get together and just accomplish like wild topics. There's DAOs right now that are tackling diversity and inclusion, something that, you know, we messed up in Web2, but are really conscious of and trying to do a much better job in Web3. There are things that we're tackling in terms of the climate. And like crypto, Web3, DAOs, they're going to play a really big part in carbon credits and so forth. So there's a lot of like really neat opportunity in that space. Absolutely.
Well, I hate to be the vibe killer right now. I'm about to bring us back to reality. Steve, unless you want to say something real quick before
I'll throw in just one last thing as for the folks in the room, in the virtual room, I guess, that are new to Web3 and have come here to learn about it. And there's a lot of Web3 jargon. And one of the things you might hear about and think is a bad word, which is permissionless, is actually a good word. It's just because it's what Adele and Thomas were basically saying. And so I'm just going to give you a quick definition. Like what permissionless means here is that there is no central authority to give you permission to do things on the public blockchain, whether it is to spin up a new project or protocol or participate in a particular transaction or participate or spin up one of these DAOs that Thomas was just talking about. So by comparison, we briefly mentioned the JP Morgan Chase, and I used the term permissionless there, saying that was a permissioned blockchain, which means you could also have blockchains that are cut off, right? So what JP Morgan did was use the blockchain Web3 technology, but made it private. But most blockchains like Ethereum and all these other blockchains you might hear about are permissionless, which allows anyone to just kind of come on and start building and let the market react to it. So I'll just leave it at that and let you ask the next question. And by the way, I want to take a little credit for your crypto education, because when I met you back in May, you were rolling your eyes and said, it's all scams. And I sent you a Wired article that was an 18,000 word article about how you could actually, track down criminals on the blockchain. And you thanked me for it. So I just want some credit. Just throwing out
That's
there. Take
true.
1% credit for your education.
It's true. It's very true. I went to this Web3 opportunity in New Orleans in March, and I still have to say though, Steve, I'm not 100% down with like all crypto. I know that eventually ethically I will feel that it's where I want it to be so that I'm 100% in. But to each their own. I'm still here for the innovation, and I'm here for all of the positive change that can come from the blockchain. But honestly, I have to piggyback off of what you just were talking about, bringing up a little bit of crypto. There's been some negative headlines in the past week or so folks might have seen related to crypto, FTX in particular. Whether we are going to be speaking about crypto in general or Web3 broadly, what is something, whether it's negative headlines, positive headlines, whatever, what is something that each of you want regulators, lawmakers, people who are going to be seeing these stories and making decisions that could be impacting you and your business, what do you want them to understand about Web3? Is it, let's not let one bad apple ruin the bunch? Is it we learned something from this that we can continue to build upon and make better? Just kind of like if you could sit down with a lawmaker or regulator and say, hey, maybe don't be so scared or so reactive right now, or I can help you understand this a little better, what would you say?
Which one of you wants
I got to start with you, Steve.
Sure. More than happy to tackle that one, right? Obviously FTX, and it's not just FTX. There was some other bad news back in May and June with with just some similar meltdowns. And you obviously can look at a lot of these outright fraud, which is what occurred, and then you could take one or two type of paths. You could be like, wow, this is fraud, so it's all fraud, and react that way. Or you can say, how do we prevent frauds like this from happening, right? Because this was fraud in a Bernie Madoff style fashion. This was a complete, really a con artist, for lack of a better term. I mean, like as of this morning, the Chapter 11 filings that are coming out are amazing. I mean, like the company was basically approving expenses with emojis and Slack channels. I mean, like there was no accounting, there was no accountability, right? So it was a poorly run organization that, quite frankly, didn't embrace the values of decentralization, right? It was a very centralized, tightly controlled by one individual who became a multi-billionaire and things like that. So what I would like to talk to regulators and legislators and policymakers about is, when you think of the quote crypto or Web3 or whatever it is, whatever moniker you use, is remember that it's actually about 7 or 8 different things. And each one of those things probably needs a regulator's or a legislature's touch. However, they all need different rules and regulations and things like that, because you need to segment it, right? Because there are centralized exchanges like FTX, right? Which would be comparable to like a Fidelity, right? Or actually they were even stranger, because they were a combination of an exchange and a marketplace. So they were like the New York Stock Exchange and Fidelity merged into one. Like that never should have been allowed to happen, but it was, because it was offshore, because there wasn't the regulatory clarity. And just this morning, one of the US exchanges, Kraken, they were turned down by a similar venture capitalist that invested into FTX, because they said, you guys are too big and too fat. Like you have 100 people working just on security, and FTX is making billions with just 50 people in the whole company. Now we understand, right? But Kraken is regulated by US authorities, right? So I would say that, there's centralized exchanges, there's decentralized finance, there's stable coins, there's NFTs, right? And then there are, just other branches. There's tokens, and then there's level 1 tokens, level 2 tokens, right? So each of these are different things. What I would like to communicate is each one of those does need some form of oversight, but they all need different oversight. So you can't, let's make one big sweeping piece of legislation that's going to bucket all of it together, right? So work with the industry folks that are willing to have those conversations.
Absolutely. Taking a step back from just crypto, happy to talk about other things in the Web3 space that you're wanting regulators to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a crisis in the space. It's a bit of a Wild West at the moment. And, I think we are at a point where technologies, even just looking at it from the economic perspective, its impact on society is too big to proceed without moving in step with the regulatory processes of society. That's very clear. And I think that this sort of ambiguous or unclear, murky state that we find ourselves in with this technology here in the US particularly breeds things like FTX. It's a festering ground for that. Because if you leave it to the market is always going to look for, outlandish profits over everything else. And the only way that you actually manage to get some sort of controls on that is with regulation. And that's why the financial market is so heavily regulated in that sense. Now, of course, there is a danger because this is new. It's a new technology, and we don't know how to regulate it essentially now. And that's okay. I think it's okay to be candid about that. and to create a path to regulation that drives knowledge and informs the regulators as well as the industry in that sense. So, for example, in our preparatory calls, we discuss things like the sandbox in the UK by the FCA, the sandbox in Singapore. And these kind of measures where you de-risk the potential fallout of experimentation and innovation are very, very helpful, because it gives entrepreneurs an opportunity to experiment and to find models that work and that can resonate. It gives regulators a model to be able to understand the issues at hand more closely. And it gives the market a way to actually, interact with these innovations to see what's actually going to stick versus what's going to fail. And, I think things like the Jobs Act have been really important, because if you remember at the beginning of the Web3 movement, we had the whole ICO phase, and that, really got killed by regulation primarily. And there were scams as well as everything. But, fundamentally, it was about crowdfunding. It was about retail investors getting involved in investing in opportunities. So we've found a way to be able to do that now with RegCF, when, it's now up to 5 million that companies can raise through RegCF. So I would love to see that kind of framework in place. If I was to have two asks of regulators, it would be to have something akin to RegCF, where we can experiment with whatever kind of tokens, whatever kind of digital assets or frameworks, with a ceiling of, say, with a safe ceiling. It's regulators to determine what that is. RegCF started with $1 million. It rose to 5 million today. I'm sure it will rise to further amounts in the future. And the second thing would be to create this kind of sandbox environment, because I think the biggest challenge at the moment is that there is no path for ethical, compliant companies to actually create tokenized assets today. There is no legal path, and the only people who really make money in this scenario are the lawyers. It's basically, you've got to have 7-8 figure lawyer fees to be able to launch anything of any significance at this stage.
And I think what you're referencing to, or a great example, is what happened in New York State with BitLicense. But actually taking like one step back, because I'll get to that in a second, I think in today's Web3 world, we are very early. There's no real experts in Web3 just because we're still figuring it out. If we bring regulation in today as it is, it will literally destroy and stifle innovation. And it will also probably help encourage bad actors like FTX happen offshore. And I think people say, and I don't like, it isn't totally true if we say it is the Wild West, because we already have regulation from like theft is illegal, whether that's in the Web3 world and the Web2 world, or if you like want to take or if you like want to chop down like a neighbor's tree or something like that, right? So theft is legal, scams, fraud, this is all illegal today. And there's a lot of regulation that's actually happening and taking place. We're in such an early stage where we really need to figure out what the powerful Web3 can actually solve. Because if we act too quickly, we will really stifle that. A great example might be to all the regulation that was being imposed, and this is kind of parallel to what was happening in the 90s. For example, when email first came out, it was very scary. Like, wow, that was something. And now we can't imagine living without email or e-commerce. People might not like their email today, but let alone it's become a standard form of communication. And if we start regulating something like Web3 today so early at its infant stages, then we don't know what really powerful technologies and powerful problems it might be able to solve in the future. So that's something I really want to keep in mind. And with reference to BitLicense that happened in New York, so this was an attempt for New York to protect New York consumers and bring regulation into New York State. And you can see is that there's hundreds of organizations and businesses that are, and thousands arguably, that are in the Web3 ecosystem. Yet over the past 6 years, there's actually only been 20 that have received a BIT license to operate within New York City or New York State. I'm pretty sure it's 20. Del, what you were saying in terms of, oh man, I lost my train of thought here. But the thing is that we're going to lose a lot of innovation, and we're going to help encourage bad actors to move offshore if we don't have these environments and these sandboxes, because we're, again, at the really early infant stages.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of pull on a thread there. You know, you were talking about how we don't even know what Web3 is going to be able to do for us. We're starting to see some of the exciting applications. But, you know, Steve knows this. I can't get through an interaction without mentioning TikTok. So here I go. I was scrolling the other day, and I saw something that, you know, it broke my heart, but it also blew my mind at the same time. You know, due to climate change, rising sea levels, the nation of Tuvalu is coming to terms with the fact that their land is soon not going to be there. And they announced that they are now the first digital nation in the world. So leaders there plan to use the metaverse to preserve land and culture for future generations far after that nation is gone. And I know that that's very heavy, but it also highlights an amazing opportunity that Web3 is providing on a gap that it can fill. So I want to kind of wrap up this discussion and hear from each of you. You know, what excites you the most about Web3? What problems do you see being solved that make you excited to be in this space? And what do you see for the future in the next you know, decade or so in this space?
I'm happy to go first, and I love the story about the culture being preserved in the metaverse in case they can't live in their land anymore. And to me, it shows there's a difference between, you know, this is a little political science term, a difference between a nation and a state, right? Like France, the French people are a nation, the country of France is the state, hence a nation state. So they could preserve their nation even if they don't have a state in the future in the metaverse, which would be amazing, right? So that's great. And it's actually the technology is what excites me about the future. So the ability of folks to do exactly what you just described. Also the ability to compete with the existing technology. Like I remember some of the original missions of ACT, you know, we formed 20 something years ago around the Microsoft era when they were deemed a monopoly. And I was involved, and I've been a member of the App Association way back then. And I remember back then people saying like, there's just no alternative to Microsoft and Intel. And now look, innovation came, the mobile phone, and like there's competition in the marketplace. And I feel that, you know, Web3 just drops a great amount of innovation out, or technology that allows entrepreneurs to build innovation, whether it's a metaverse, whether it's a cryptocurrency, whether it's a DAO, whatever it is, whether it's a decentralized finance protocol, and compete with the established players. So, you know, I know there's the extreme folks in the space that are like, we're going to take down the banks. You know, I actually look at it more like you're going to compete with the banks and make both better. Or we're going to take down Google. Probably not, but you're going to make Google better and make them become a little more decentralized. So the pressure, the competitive capitalistic pressure, that's a good thing, right? I know we're not supposed to say that out loud anymore, maybe, right? But the competitive capitalistic pressure that the new technology, the new entrants into the marketplace will put on all the established players, whether it's, you know, Google, whether it's JP Morgan, whomever, right? To me is what's exciting.
So
no, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
So again, from like a development perspective, I think there's so many cool things that can happen and possibilities too. So people have probably seen in the news that getting a ticket to Taylor Swift's concerts has been pretty difficult. It's been a little bit of a fiasco. If you're not familiar with it, it was really hard to get a ticket. People were being, you know, kind of selected at random. Ticketmaster was going down, all this other stuff. In Web3, imagine a world where Taylor Swift can individually kind of say like, hey, if you listen to my song, if you are the biggest fan of mine, I can give you an NFT, or you can earn an NFT because you've had X number of streams. All of a sudden, instead of someone who wants to buy and resell a ticket just for the pure economic profit, she can actually connect with her fans directly, as opposed to through an intermediary. And then imagine that you have that power to prove to your friends or invest in some of her music and so forth. From a metaverse standpoint, imagine if you have a digital asset in a game that you can bring to the metaverse, that you can resell again in a different way, and leverage maybe even as a financial tool to help you get collateralized loans and so forth, or just connect and work with people in DAOs and guilds. I'm kind of bouncing around here, but there's just countless different opportunities on what we can do. And I'm just so excited to see how that can like progress forward. I think that's what excites me the most about Web3, because previously this stuff wasn't possible. And some might argue that there's a lot of the stuff that you can probably figure out in Web 2, but at the core of it is, no, you can't, because Web 3 is decentralized, and there's never been a body that can be so decentralized that can actually solve these like really cool opportunities and problems that we're still to yet, come across.
Yeah, I mean, I echo, I think, both Thomas and Steve's points in terms of the possibilities. I think, what I'm really excited about with decentralized technologies is that I think that, the pandemic really exposed that the 20th century systems are not fit for purpose for 21st century problems. And whether, for example, at the outbreak of the pandemic, there was a crisis of data. We just didn't have a clue what was going on. And the ability for us to be able to assimilate vast amounts of data at scale, at planetary scale, through decentralized systems is the kind of possibilities that this technology presents. And I think that's, again, when we start to look at things like climate, there are pilots that are going on around the world now where they're measuring sea levels at shipping, docking stations, docking yards. And based on that, being able to make very accurate predictions in terms of rising sea levels and the like. And it's this kind of planet scale system with data that we can rely on and trust, and where we have permissionlessness and trustlessness. And I do want to, one thing I did want to say, people, that term, you'll hear a lot of libertarian kind of viewpoints, as Steve was like reflecting on earlier. We're going to destroy the banks and all of this and that in the Web3 space. But I think that is a bit misleading. It's not a space of no governance. It's where governance can be automated, and that you don't need a central authority to implement and affect that governance. And when you look at the kind of things that can start to do for society, we can start to actually codify inclusion. We can start to codify diversity. We can start to codify equitability and more pedestrian challenges as well. So, this is the real, I think there's an opportunity for technology and society to converge in a way to achieve social outcomes that have really eluded us over the industrial era, and really kind of heal the planet in many ways, and really kind of create a new wave of prosperity for humanity as a species. And that's what I'm really excited about with this space.
Awesome. Well, that just made me even more excited about Web3 than I already was. We do have a question in the chat that I would like to throw out there, and really anyone can answer, but I think Steve, with your your investor POV, you might be the right one. So we have a question here. We are building a Web3 digital health platform with the premise being get paid to get healthy. The reception from users is great, but the healthcare system sees this concept as too foreign and maybe even risky, despite the incredible good it could bring to our current and broken system. Any ideas of where we can find a health ecosystem where it is safe to explore these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's not even necessarily a Web3 question insofar as I get this in venture capital all the time when there's an old stodgy business or an old stodgy industry, and then there is a new entrance, right? And really there's ultimately really one way to do it is go prove them wrong, right? Meaning is find a way, whether it's in a sandbox that we were talking about, whether it's working with regulators and doing it a little slower, finding a pilot that's willing to bring you in under their umbrella, because you can do this in a pretty HIPAA compliant way. It's actually not that hard. But more importantly is I tell folks is you want to attract both financial capital, like folks like myself, and customers. It's really, really simple. You have to do two things. You have to prove that you're a sustainable business that scales, right? So when I see paid to get healthy, right, make sure it's not like Steppen, right, which was great when tokens were $12 gazillion, and now that tokens are like a point bazillion decimal points of a dollar, no one's using Steppen anymore, right? So prove that you're scalable, prove that the tokenomics or whatever it is, paid to get healthy, is sustainable long-term, not something that builds on top of more users coming into the system, and then prove that you can scale, prove that you can do this with millions and hundreds of millions of people. And that unlocks both the big customers that don't necessarily believe you at first, and it unlocks the venture capital, right? And if we learned anything from FTX faked that. But that's why they were able to go put their name on sports arenas and umpire uniforms and attract venture capital, because they faked that, right? Because that shows you how powerful of a tool that is. I know that I'm using a counterfactual here, right, to prove the point. But the reality is that's why they were trying to fake that, because they know that that's the secret formula of getting funding and getting the credibility.
I want to give other folks an opportunity if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I think Thomas is absolutely right. You kind of need to prove them wrong and solve problems that they can't solve. I mean, healthcare in the US is a $4.7 trillion industry, when it's a $8.9 trillion industry globally. So effectively, healthcare is like defense for the US. The US spends more on healthcare than the rest of the world combined. And yet the outcomes in terms of people's health here is not, we don't index as the healthiest country on the planet. Right. So, there's a burning opportunity there in that regards. But yeah, I do understand the problem. And I, worked on healthcare solutions with data and blockchain extensively, and it is very difficult. But I think, there's a confluence of forces coming to the space now. And again, I think regulation is a friend in this sense, and HIPAA does throw up many challenges, but it also is the only kind of real protection. That's one of the few classes of data of personal data where we have significant protections in place at the moment. So one of the issues that we're actually working on at the moment is that it's one of the challenges, and we see a massive explosion of telehealth, for example, following the pandemic. But again, the Cerebral the other day was, they misdiagnosed, to mental health patients, etc. So there's this challenge of longitudinal data in the healthcare space, and it's very difficult to achieve because service providers are not allowed to have a universal patient indicator. So we've been working on a protocol whereby we can maintain patient anonymity across systems, but allow patients, and again, by giving patients sovereignty, they can assemble and aggregate all of their data into a single framework and then share this in a longitudinal manner with service providers accordingly. It's going to be challenging to get that traction and scale, but it's really about finding the proof points, because I think once you find the proof points, the problems are so colossal. And if you can have an impact there, then the market has to pay attention effectively from that point. So I think you just have to keep banging on and finding that inflection point where you can find the proof point that allows you to tell a story that you can amplify to then scale.
Thomas, before you jump in, we got a question that addresses something that you said that totally relates to all of this. So you mentioned email being widely used, but yet a lot of doctors' offices still use fax machines because of a combination of regulation and the fact that they don't want decentralized data. How should we see, or how do we already see Web3 solving these problems? And I know that Deli just touched on that, but I want to give an opportunity if you want to dive deeper, or Thomas, if you want to jump in with your answer here.
Yeah, I guess I can like kind of combine both. To this particular question about like, well, fax and email and how we're progressing if there's a solution that Web3 can bring to the table. I think absolutely. The most obvious one is that Web3 represents ownership. And what we really mean by that is self-ownership. So you owning your data. I think it's personally or absolutely reasonable to think that if you go to a doctor's office, you have that data on you, and it's not a third party. It's not a doctor's office. It's not a dentist's office or someone that actually controls that and has that. And you have to fight and go through hoops and so forth to actually get that, versus them inputting it into your own personal record. And you see a little bit of the shift actually happening right now. Web3 is going to make that infinitely better. And it's kind of mirrors what we see also happening in the finance space, where it kind of lets people actually have their own almost like personal bank, because they have this might get too deep. They have their own wallet where they have their own funds, but it could also be their own personal, health information. It could also hold something like NFTs that, the expensive JPEG thing, that's part of it, but there's so much more to just NFTs. But I think as we progress with time, as things become more decentralized, things like HIPAA might actually not become as important, because the people that are holding and being the custodians of our data no longer need to be custodians of our data, which is going to be pretty cool. And then to the first question about the whole health systems, I think that mindset is I'm not saying it's a bad mindset. There's a lot of Web2 companies out there. If you want to put a Web3 lens on it, instead of you being the one that is going to the health systems, I might kind of challenge the perspective, or bring the perspective of, well, what if you created this is again a first idea that came to mind, of like a DAO, where people buy into the fact that we are committing to be healthy, and creating a community of people that want to be healthy enough, and then almost creating your own kind of like an insurance kind of employer group that the insurance company could actually approach and want to insure, because there's that authenticity there's that authenticity and proof, that trustlessness, right, of these members of this community actually being healthy and proving that so, which could be actually, really cool. And all of a sudden you have an insurance product then that could be sold instead of for insurance companies. It's like people are coming to you. And I think that could be kind of interesting. So I don't know if any of that made sense, but those are my kind of two takes.
I'll just quick add on top of that, two quick things is you could also have, Web3 technology, to address Mike's question, right, is you can have a permissioned blockchain, similar to what JP Morgan did with those tokenized deposits right on the Polygon network, moving it from the Bank of Japan to the Bank of Singapore, right, where the healthcare providers participate in a permissioned blockchain, which then can hold and store the records in that regard, right? So this is one of the areas where you can actually have a combination of regulatory compliance and technical innovation. And as Thomas said, then like HIPAA becomes a little less of a necessary, becomes a little less necessary because of the technology, right? Because the technology, a lot of that can be coded right into the smart contracts, right? So that's definitely an area where I could see some of that improvement.
I don't want to unmute myself too fast. Is there anything else we want to touch on that question? I know that we were able to dive into some healthcare stuff, which is always great. So, okay, cool. Well, we are just about at time. I want to definitely remind folks that this is just episode 1 of our Web3 series. We're going to be having a whole slew of webinars and events coming up that drill down a little bit more into specific things about Web3. We're going to have one that's just centered around crypto. We're also going to have one that's completely centered around IP and the role that IP plays when it comes to blockchain, Web3, and decentralization. So please keep your eyes and ears peeled out for all that good stuff. We're also going to be having this webinar on our YouTube channel that should be posted by the end of the week. You can also find a recap of this event on our blog very soon. I think that's all I have, other than a giant thank you again to our panelists for all of their amazing insights. I learned so much more than I even imagined, and I valued each and every one of your insights, as I'm sure all of our attendees did. Before we say goodbye, are there any parting words, any casual reminders we'd like to give people about the world of Web3 before we sign off here?
Yeah, I mean, I would throw something in. I think, it's very much doing space. And it's sort of like, we had the reference about emails. When emails first arrived, nobody really understood what they were, and it's like, what's this little app thing? And and remember when they were case sensitive as well, which was a nightmare. Right? But you learned by doing, right? You learned by actually getting an email account and sending an email, and now lo and behold, everybody sort of understands that. And I think that's similar. It becomes a much less scary space when you dip your feet in. So, I would recommend that people get a wallet, get some, nominal amount. I mean, tens of dollars is fine in terms of cryptocurrencies. Buy something, whether it's a JPEG or whether it's a game asset, or if it's just sending it as a gift to someone. I think, learn by doing. I think that you'll become, next thing you know, in 6 months' time, you'll be an expert. You'll
be a panelist on our next webinar.
Exactly.
I agree that wholeheartedly. There's so many people that just dismiss crypto because they see the debacles. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to even sweep those under the rug. There's tons of scams in crypto, just like there's more phone scams than there are crypto scams, yet we don't ban the phone and dismiss telephonetic technology, right? So my advice is jump in. And just see what it's about before you just blanketly, cast it aside as useless and worthless technology, useless, worthless space. And just as like a reminder is like, people who didn't get NFTs, like last Christmas, I gave them all NFTs for Christmas. So they had to go get a wallet and they had to go do things. And like, I had someone who was the biggest NFT skeptic of all time. And he's a big coffee nut. And I gave him this thing called Crypto Baristas NFT. And it actually comes with like bags of coffee and a Discord group where people talk about, and now he loves it and he gets it. He goes, oh, so like this NFT unlocks all of this utility. I'm like, duh, that's what all of us nerds have been saying. And I admit crypto has a messaging problem and this problem and a that problem. But I mean, at the same time, everything I hear about crypto today, I heard about the web in like circa 1995, right? So don't just dismiss it. Go out there and give it a shot, and talk to people that are into it for help and advice, right? Not some crazy person on Twitter.
Yes, very good point.
I'd add probably not to bring it back to regulation, but just recognizing that bad regulation is going to be worse than no regulation. And we're in a state right now where we're still trying to figure out what we could possibly regulate, down the road. So let's let it grow. I keep on trying to picture and get a better analogy, but I think this is like a baby seal, and we're still in its prepubescent kind of like age of life, especially if you think about the funny names that are just being used in the Web3 space, like NFTs stand for non-fungible tokens. What is fungible? Why is that even like a concept here? And so forth. But like Deli and like Steve were saying, get involved in a project. If you like TV, for example, there's a cool project I just got involved with called Crapopolis from Dan Harmon, who's the co-creator of Rick and Morty. And basically you can mint these crap chicken NFTs, which then give you voting power on what can actually happen in the show, which is just kind of like so cool. And there's just so many different ways. So yeah, get an NFT, get a wallet, get involved in a project, start learning more, and then seeing like where it can go. And yeah, maybe you too can be rich off of JPEG.
Great message.
Not financial advice.
Yeah, not financial advice. That was a joke. Yeah.
Sure, Gary Gensler's listening in. So not financial advice.
All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. I already know that I'll be getting all of my people on my Christmas list, maybe some spooky little NFTs.
Coffee Bros or
like I said, this is going to be up on YouTube here soon, and we're going to have links to all the good stuff. Anything that we referenced or anything like that will be in the description of the YouTube. And thank you again to all of our panelists and attendees for making this event so great. See ya.